Hello, everybody, and welcome to Everything Women's Wrestling, the FloWrestling podcast where we talk about everything women's wrestling. This is episode 1, and I'm your host, Lori Ayres, co-founder of Division I Women's Wrestling, an organization working to educate, grow, and support women who want to wrestle at the Division I level. So we are going to jump right into the show today, but before we get started with our first guest, Jacque Davis, who, by the way, is an amazing thought leader in women's wrestling, I'm going to share just the tiniest bits of information about my background. So most of the information about how I'm involved in wrestling will play out in conversations with guests over the first few episodes. But I do want listeners right now to know that I absolutely love the sport of wrestling. I always have. I've spent almost 45 years now, mat side, on the edge of the mat, just wanting to be a part of the sport. And to be quite honest with you, it took me a while to know how I could be a part of the sport, even though I was so drawn to it. There were times when I really didn't feel comfortable taking up space in the sport, but that's not true anymore. I feel comfortable being here, and part of what I want to do and how I want to use my skill sets in the national wrestling community is to make sure that other people feel like they can belong to. Because as we've heard before, everybody can wrestle. So with that being said, we are going to get started. I'm going to bring on Jacque Davis, and Jackie's going to start our very first Everything Women's Wrestling podcast with some information on a personal project that she's been working on for several months now. And so let's go ahead and see what that's all about. So welcome, Jacque Davis.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, and hello.
Walter Pepperman the fourth.
Yes, say hi, everybody. This is the youngest Peppelman to make it on the flow. He's rocking his D1 women's wrestling onesie. We had a different one on, but we had a little bit of an accident, didn't we? But it's okay. We don't have to talk about it. But yeah, women's wrestling advocate from birth, everybody.
Oh my gosh, Jacque, we are so happy for you. Look at that guy. How's he doing today? Is he having a good day?
Good. Yes, he doesn't like diaper changes, so he had a little bit. He told us how much he felt about that. No shame, but besides that, good day. He got to see his grandparents and his uncles and his aunties today. We just went back to Pennsylvania, and last night he went to his first live wrestling duel, and he got to go to Central Dauphin High School, where his uncles and his dad went, and he got to watch the team wrestle. We got to see the wrestling room, and he got to see old pictures of his dad and his uncles on the wall of the school. It was pretty cool. They got these little shrines all around, so it was fun, huh, little buddy? A Peppelman returning.
Oh, we love it. Oh my gosh. Well, Walter, this is so cool. And thank you, Walter, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We know that, there's family waiting to hold you and love you and all those things. So I'm going to flip back and introduce Mommy, Walter, look at you looking. He's so alert. I love it. Hi. Yes. I'm going to send you back to Grandma and Daddy and everybody. Okay. He's waving. And we're going to introduce Mommy, all right? So, Mommy, we'll see you in a few here.
All right, bye.
Okay. All right, so Jackie's going to come back and join us in a second. But I'm going to tell you that Jacque, for the past decade, has passionately amplified girls' and women's wrestling initiatives at the local, regional, and national levels. She's held the role of Women's Wrestling Director for Beat the Streets New York, Beat the Streets Providence, and Boston Youth Wrestling, as well as roles of Women's Director and National Team Coach for New York USA Wrestling, Massachusetts USA Wrestling, and Rhode Island USA Wrestling. At the national level, she's traveled and coached for Team USA at, get this, 17 international tours, including Cadet and Junior Pan Am American Championships and World Championships. While in New York, Davis established the Gotham City Girls Open, which is the largest international girls freestyle tournament in the country. Davis was awarded the 2016 Development Coach of the Year by USA Wrestling and was the 2016 recipient of the Dan Gable America Needs Wrestling Award. She wrestled 4 years at Menlo College under the late Lee Allen, as well as Marcy Van Dusen, and finished her career as a collegiate All-American. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and bring Jackie back in. All right. The handoff went okay?
Smooth. Perfect timing. We were on the razor's edge of, will I go to sleep or will I cause a ruckus? So good handoff.
That's usually, that's a good time to hand them off to dad. So good stuff.
Yeah. Something only dad can handle, right?
All right, Jackie. So I don't think there could be a better question to start off our Everything Women's Wrestling podcast, but this one. So we're going to start with the question, the one everyone is thinking. You were a wrestler, right? You wrestled at Menlo, you wrestled in high school. And so were there parallels between pregnancy and childbirth? And did you like draw on what you learned in the sport of wrestling to get through those things?
Okay, so I was, yes, there are certainly parallels. And before getting pregnant, I was like nervous about the whole thing. So I was interviewing all of my friends who had all had babies. And some of those friends are women who are high level athletes, like Catherine Shy, who also had a son and then went back to wrestling. And I'm like, oh my gosh, tell me all about this stuff. You know, like I need to be prepared for it. Give me the good, the bad, the ugly. Don't hide anything. And she was like, you know, when you're like in a match and you're so tired and there's like 10 seconds left and you don't think you can push through and you turn to your coach and look, like at the corner and you look at them and you're like, what do I do? And they're like, you just go, like you can't stop. Like, and I'm like, she's like, that's how it is. So I guess in the having the baby part, like that's just you just go, you got to do it. But the whole other thing, like I was telling my family, it sounds silly, but I'm like, I'm training for this like it's my Olympics, you know?
Not
like,
silly. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I will be, I'm what I'm eating, how I'm sleeping, when and how I'm working out, who I'm putting myself around, what I'm reading. This is like my Olympics. And it felt very much like training in college for national championships, you know, like all of the preparation. And I think probably the biggest part is there's a lot of moments of uncertainty and there's a lot of moments where you're scared. And now that I have the little guy, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to keep him alive. This is, now he's here. I have to keep him alive. And just like being so grateful, like so much gratitude. And maybe my last thing is being part of a team. You know, like my husband and I from the very beginning, my husband Walter and I from the very beginning were determined to make sure that this was a team effort, right? That we both had parts in it so that we could each contribute and feel like we had connections. And so like knowing that, yeah, there's a lot of individual pieces to it, but that you're a part of a team that's much larger. And it's been a really beautiful thing to watch him be a dad and us like be a really good team together.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so important, right? Because you know, women wrestling at the college level and having aspirations for continuing to try to wrestle even at the senior level. So like Catherine Shy, for instance, she's such a mentor for us, and it's good to have these conversations. So awesome. All right. So we are going to, you and I have a great conversation here about what this podcast can and hopefully will be all about. And then we're going to roll into topics that we think would be great to cover in the first few episodes. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is really like what kind of audience do we want here on the show, and what do we want to see happen to hopefully see more and more people get on board with advocating for women's wrestling. And so the first sort of thought and conversation I want to have back and forth with you, Jackie, is I'm hoping that this podcast can be educational in the way that we start to see more people understanding the importance of equity in the sport. And so I guess to think about sort of that flip, right? So my question is, what do you think is that flipping point? Like, what are some of the variables that we've seen over the years in terms of a person who maybe is sort of lackluster or neutral about women's wrestling, but then they become advocates? What do you see as some things that happen to make that happen?
Yeah. This is like a topic that we talk about in women's wrestling all the time. I think, you know, you and I, Lori, have talked about this separately. And I feel like for me, I was mostly on the coaching front, and in the past few months, obviously been working on my own project, but on the coaching front, I've always seen a flip when a coach who mostly coaches boys or men finally gets the opportunity to coach a young woman, and they've never experienced it before. And so you don't know what you don't know. And as soon as they have the opportunity to be in the same space with a young woman and coach her and be a part of her story, then it 100% flips. They're like, I only want to coach women. Why? They listen, they work hard, they don't like, they ask good questions, like they're determined. They're so much easier. Like they're not as complicated. So I feel like that's like being able to have access to someone who is in the sport, a female in the sport that they've never had access to, and getting to share and learn their stories. That's like the biggest time I've seen a big switch.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And I think if we can try to tell some of those narrative stories, right? So those narrative stories where coaches get to know the women and get to know the girls, and they feel that, oh my gosh, of course they love this sport. Why wouldn't they? We love it too. It flips them over to understanding, why wouldn't we want this for everybody? So definitely that personal connection. So I hope we can do that. I hope on this show we can share some of those personal connections so that it doesn't always take a coach or like, someone who's knows like their niece wrestles or their sister wrestles in order to get them to start to advocate for wrestling. So very cool. That's definitely something we want to try to do here. And then I think it's really, we can't not bring up the fact that we do need to see more media coverage in sports. I mean, for women, right? Like we have a long way to go in that area. And so this podcast is a great way to continue to cover athletics, especially women's wrestling. And I love that Flo is stepping up and allowing us to have this platform and space, right? And so we're going to see what we can do with it. Is it perfect now? Are we completely equitable with men? Of course not yet, but we're building towards that. And so I think kind of my question for you, Jackie, is what should we be looking for? Like we can't go from 0 to 60. We know that's not going to happen. But what kind of advocacy should we be sort of promoting or wanting to see in the women out there, or in not just the women, the men too, right? Like we want to make sure that we're partnering with this and there's not like you versus them kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
What kind of things do we want to see? What kind of change do we want to see?
Okay, so maybe I'm gonna flip this a little. I actually think that somebody I can't remember who said this to me, and oh my gosh, it was probably somebody amazing. So sorry that I'm not mentioning you because I'm sure you're amazing. But one of a female mentor of mine said to me that like like women's media matters, right? Like women in media matters, but like if us women aren't tuning in and supporting it, then it gets taken away. The opportunity gets taken away, right? Because it's almost like proving that people aren't interested or it's not making enough money on it. And it doesn't even have to be the sport that you love. So I actually think I'm flipping this to say, like, I would like to see everyone thinking about the responsibility that we have. If we have an opportunity to get access to anything, to locker rooms or gear or media, that we're paying attention to it. So almost like a call to action, watch women's sports, tune in to women's basketball, to lacrosse, to soccer, to wrestling, and give viewership to women in sports so that we don't lose the opportunity. They're looking at numbers, they're looking at money, many of these like large streaming or TV channels. And gosh, all we can do is just support.
I agree. We have to support, right? And as it becomes more regular, and if we can get shows like this, and we know that they're going to be coming out on a certain cadence, we can tune in. I feel like sometimes it's hard at this point because you have to sort of do this digging piece. Like we're not going to turn on the TV and see women's sports shown, and so. But you're right. And on our end, we have to do the digging, and we have to make sure we support any articles and podcasts and any kind of coverage that we see. So great point. So,
yeah.
Right?
Oh, I had one other thing now I'm thinking about it. Like, I also think there's a response, like, the media coverage, responsibility of just thinking about the different people you're targeting, like you're talking about. If it's hard to find, then, you know, are we shooting ourselves in the foot from the beginning? If it's difficult to find, then people can't watch it, then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So, you know, the young community, they're on Snapchat and Twitter and whatever. Older communities are on Facebook. Some people are only on like local TV channels. So really think about diversifying where this media coverage goes out to.
Yeah, and we're going to have on this show, Jacque, we're going to have everybody. We're not going to limit it to only women. I'd love to have some of the Flow, you know, wrestling people on to talk through some things with them. And I want to be on, you know, maybe even their shows and talk a little bit with them on there. So we want to have D1 athletes, male and female. So runs the gamut, really. And we want to partner with wrestling right now and all take a step forward with women's wrestling. It's super, super important. So, but it is, what else is super important is understanding where we are right now with women in media and how we are covering women's athletics. And so I just want to bring up really quickly a study that was just, you know, reported on in 2019. It's actually a longitudinal study, like a 30-year study on how we are supporting women in sports in the media. And so Cheryl Cookie, a professor out of Purdue University, was, you know, part of a 30-year data collection study, and some of the researchers out of Southern California, the University of Southern California, were helping to do this early on, and she sort of took it over. So in 2019, she reported that the coverage of women's athletes on televised news and highlight shows, and this is including, Jacque, ESPN SportsCenter. So when we're tuning on to those televised news and highlight shows, they took a total of the amount of time that we spend broadcasting about athletics for all athletics. And in all of the total airtime, we only had, in 2019, 5.45, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.4% of all the airtime that covered women in athletics. So that's not good, right? It's not good.
Yeah, right. So I actually only briefly read a little bit and talked a little bit about this study in an internship I did over the summer. And I think this is an important thing too, if you're a consumer of any media or any studies or any research on women in sport, like just make sure that you're really reading these things and you're not just kind of skipping to like the sticky points. You know, like read Cookie's research and support that and go through the results on it, because there's some positive stuff for positive findings in this study and other studies, you know. So other than that's a very sticky statistic, but like go in and read it and like find the information so you can disseminate it properly too, you know. And I think that's another responsibility that we have as consumers.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, you know, but I think data is powerful, right? It is important to know where we're starting at this point. And honestly, not just where we're starting, but this longitudinal study goes back 30 years, and 30 years even before this, back in 1989, we only had 5% of that airtime on the same kind of data collection. So the point is that in 30 years worth of time, we really haven't made a ton of progress. So we want to start changing, right? Like nothing changes if nothing changes. So to both our points, I guess we need to start doing something a little differently. So I think clearly we want to cover this. So now we'll move from like what we hope we can do with this podcast to you and I, Jacque, going back and forth and talking about, we got really excited about this and we started to think about possible topics that we can cover on Everything Women's Wrestling. And so
you have to tune in for like the next 50 years, because we got topics on topics on topics on topics.
Right? I mean, we couldn't even, the list, we had to sort of like cut it to be able to fit it into the show. We want to keep it under an hour here.
Well, let's stick to the first like 15 and then we'll get to the next 500 after
that. Right. No, for sure. So I definitely want to cover about media coverage. And so I'll kind of skip to number 2. So we want a presence for women in media, but Jackie, we also just want a presence for females in the wrestling community. So let's talk a little bit about what a show in the future could look like, Jacque, with with talking about how we go about building a bigger presence for women within our whole wrestling community. What might we talk about?
Yeah, I think it's like, well, shoot, it's low-hanging fruit. We want to talk about some of the low-hanging fruit, right? It doesn't need to be complicated. Can you add a female to your staff? Your coaching staff, your administrations, in your personal network? Are you a leader in sport, right? If you're a leader in sport, can you include a female in any leadership position? Mentorship. I think like what we need to talk about a little bit is like mentorship happens pretty organically for guys, right? Like there's men in leadership positions and there's men in positions underneath, and so out on the golf course or out for drinks that night or just chilling during lunchtime, mentorship sort of organically happens. But when there's fewer women in leadership positions and women aren't necessarily taught to ask for mentorship, they're taught to perform really well and get noticed. I think like be very aware and just cognizant that if there's not a female in your circle, include her, and one woman is not a monolith for all, right? So if you happen to be serving people of color or LGBTQ communities, or just make sure you're representing your community the best way possible.
No doubt. So that's definitely a whole episode. We could talk and talk.
Yeah.
Say so and a half. I'm going to keep it closed because it's not that episode yet. But another thought for an additional talk is, yes, we want to grow a presence of females in the sport of wrestling. And so one place that we need to do that is in Division I and on Division I campuses. And so we want to talk in an episode about non-traditional pathways that we can support at these institutions so that we can see an influx of women coming in and creating visibility. And so one way that we've been talking about that, Jackie, is and you and I have been working, we're co-founders, you and I, for Division I Women's Wrestling, that grassroots organization. So what do we do, Jackie? Can you talk a little bit about like what a show could include with discussions on these non-traditional pathways at the Division I schools, like clubs? What is that about? Why is that important?
Yeah, I think like first the episode is probably going to be like, what the heck is even happening at the D1 level, or probably what's happening at the college level for women, because women's wrestling is a little bit hard to follow. So I think it's maybe we'll just cover the beginning of what's going on, and then what are these opportunities. Over the past 30 years, basically, there have been women at D1 institutions wrestling, but similar to Dr. Cookie's kind of statistics that you mentioned earlier, Lori, not a lot of progress has happened over that 30 years. It looks very similar today as it did 30 years ago. So I think we'll talk about like, hey, can there be a women's wrestling club on campus? Can a women roster on a men's team? Can we get them as part of regional training centers? What the heck is going on with regional training centers? As these non-varsity pathways, right? It's very hard to get varsity programming. So what can we do in the meantime, I think is probably what we're going to talk about.
Exactly. And I think that message is tune in, because what we don't want to see is for us just waiting, right? Like crossing our hands and kind of hoping, or crossing our fingers and praying that that admins at schools decide at one point in the future to bring on women's wrestling. We know that that is not a good strategy. That we've tried that for 20 years and it hasn't worked, right?
Yeah.
So we got to do something different. And creating some momentum and visibility and giving opportunities is what drives that participation and growth. So excited to unpack all of that in another episode. So the other thing, though, before we move off of this topic, is I can't help but say, I think one of the biggest new learnings that we've had in our Division I women's wrestling organization, which, by the way, is made up of you and I and Emma Randall and Kira Berry and so many other amazing people. Love them. It's like that saying where it's surround yourself by people who make you better. Absolutely. You guys are like that for me, for sure.
Oh my gosh. Right back at you, man. It's like a blessing when we get to be on a call.
Yes. We have conversations like this all the time. We're just recording it now for FloWrestling. But yeah, so I think for me, one of the biggest new learnings, because we always talk about momentum, right, on Division I campuses or on any college campus to grow women's wrestling. And one of the biggest takeaways for me lately has been like, oh my gosh, we're trying to build women at these campuses. We're trying to make sure that they know they're supported, they have opportunities. But hello, we have so many men's programs at these schools that already exist, and men that if we give them a little bit of information and a little bit of encouragement, will turn on their voices for us. And so that's absolutely something we need to talk about and be explicit about. And I think it's really just getting comfortable, or asking those men to get comfortable with their capacity, right, to influence change. And then, like, to what level are they willing to use that capacity? And I think they're willing to use it. So let's bring them in and encourage them to do that. So hopefully we can talk to them.
And I mean, like, the other little tidbit is, like, when we're advancing, I think the overall theme is we're not just trying to advance women's wrestling. Nobody's just trying to advance women's wrestling. We're trying to advance wrestling as a whole, the whole entire culture, right? So how can we include men's programs into it, men's coaches into it, to advance their programs, and then bring equitable opportunity for women as well?
Mic drop. Yes, exactly. So, so obviously these non-traditional pathways are going to be important, but the ultimate goal is adding varsity programming. And so I think we were surprised to hear the mention of Title IX at that first press conference with Iowa announcing the women's program. I was. Right. So when the head athletic director got up there and said, yeah, we love women's wrestling, we wanted to do this eventually, but we weren't necessarily thinking we would do it now. But there were some issues, and he said the words Title IX. I think it surprised a lot of us. And so it is important that we learn a little bit more about Title IX, and I know that can be like a bad word in the sport of wrestling. So, like, sort of unpacking that a little bit and talking about it, having some courageous conversations is something we want to include in some of these early episodes. So we want to do that, and then I wanted to ask you, Jackie. So, in the thinking of, obviously, we want to grow wrestling for women and men, and at all levels and all associations. We were super excited to hear that Morgan State University was bringing on, this is the first historically Black college or university to bring on Division I men's wrestling. So yes. I know, right? You're involved in that. So tell us a little bit about it.
Well, so, I mean, I can't say that I did anything with that, but I am now involved in the HBCU wrestling board in order to kind of help drive women's opportunities alongside these men's opportunities that are happening at the HBCU level. And I get to be part of something really great. Carrie McCoy and Jahi Jones are basically leading this effort. Mike Novogratz is involved as well. Everyone wants to see opportunity at HBCUs. There were programs, they got dropped, and now the goal is to reinstate programs so that there's opportunity for young Black women and men to advance their athletics and their academics in a place that they feel is the right fit for them. So, it's super exciting. Morgan State is the first one to take a big step and do it. And they're starting with a men's varsity program. And they're very excited about moving forward with women's programming as well. They kind of want to get the men's up and going, and then like step in and bring either a women's club to start or a women's varsity program later down the line. And then there are several other programs, which I don't actually know if I'm supposed to talk about, so I won't, but several other schools that are talking about it and are in the process of it. So it's super exciting. I think, similar to the D1 opportunities for a lot of young women, even though there are many collegiate opportunities that exist, more now than many years in the past, some of them are just not the right fit. Like, some people still feel like they don't have the place to be. And I think HBCUs for women and men of color, and D1 opportunities for young women are two of those areas that we're trying to break through on.
All right. Well, that is so great to hear. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed for good news. We'll see, right? Something coming up. I would love to see, with the initiative and when the movement forward, a women's program added at one of these schools. So.
Oh my God, it would be amazing. And if anybody wants to be involved, or anybody wants to promote, like I said, right, we all have to be great consumers and we have to spread information. Just go to hbcwrestling.org. There's a whole website. You can see everyone that's involved, all the schools that are kind of being targeted and talking and having conversations with. Again, like I said, Carrie McCoy and Jahi Jones are the thought leaders on this, and they're really crushing it. So yeah, hbcwrestling.org. Go check it out.
I love it. We definitely will. That's so cool. Thank you so much for that shout out. Love that. All right. So we see that happening. We also, Jackie, are hearing so much about emerging sports status, invitational sports status, like all of the women's associations like NAIA, NCAA, NJCAA. We all have emerging something. So we're moving towards championship status. And we hear about programs announcing, like literally every week now, I feel like there's an announcement. And so we do have to, on this show, what we want to do is make sure we're keeping up with being transparent about where we currently are with these emerging statuses. And so updates would be important, right? And then...
right. 100%. Also, what the heck is emerging sports status? I feel like I'm pretty much in the women's wrestling weeds, real deep in it. And it's hard for me to understand, or be able to communicate it to other people. So what is emerging sports status? It's not varsity. It's not nothing. So what does it actually mean? Kind of the concept.
That is exactly correct. And if we're going to talk about things that are confusing, the ABCs and the acronyms of women's wrestling, we laugh in our house because I'll be talking about something and my husband will think I'm talking about something completely different because we're using acronyms and he thinks it's this, I think it's that. So what are some of the acronyms? Just list them off.
Okay, Holy Toledo, Holy Moses. All right, we got WCWC, WCWA, NAIA, NCWWC, NCAA, NJCAA, NWCA.
It's crazy.
I think that might be all of them. But anyways, like you said, it's the alphabet soup of women's wrestling. Mostly it's like the NCs and Ws of women's wrestling. And which entity are we actually friggin' talking about? Because there's so many of them.
Yeah, so many W's and so many C's. And it gets so confusing. So I think, I am a graphic designer on the side. And so we were talking it would be great to have some visuals where we could at least sort of lay it out and see it all. So we're hoping to do that in the future. Maybe at the beginning of every episode, we can refresh everyone on it. It's a way to start. A do now.
Oh my God. Right? Amen. And it changes every day. Some of those might phase out as others grow. And so, it's hard to keep up with.
So we're going to try to, though. We're going to try to. So, all right, so that's all some of the awesome stuff we want to get into at the college level, but literally none of this can happen at the college level if there wasn't so much work being done and having been done at the high school level. And so we definitely want to not neglect what's going on there because it's super important. One of the shows that I'm super excited to have is every time we flash up the map, right, Jack, with the states that have sanctioned, and we've talked about not loving that word and what that word means and everything, but there's always comments like, oh my gosh, why is Iowa and Pennsylvania and New York and Ohio, what the heck is wrong with these people? They get their act together. And just knowing the people behind the scenes that are working their tails off, it makes me oh, I wish they could tell their side of the story. So we want them to tell it.
Yeah. Actually, so I mentioned at the beginning when my son was here, went to a Pennsylvania duel last night, and there was one girl on one of the teams who was in the lineup, shook hands, everything. And I know that in PA, this is just a little insight. Yeah. Of course, it's not an episode for it, but PA, there's basically in order to get women's wrestling or girls wrestling sanctioned or approved at the high school level, they have to hit 100 high schools that recognize a girls team, right? So it's a pretty big feat. At 100 high schools, it's going to be a no-brainer that girls wrestling should exist. But like you said, there's so many people, there are so many teams that are welcoming young women onto it. There are so many girls that are stepping up being oh, I'm allowed to do it now that more and more teams are getting recognized, sanctioned, approved. Yeah. And I think they're at 27 or something like that right now, 30, which is in the past month, it's gone up maybe 5 programs. So it's crazy. There's a lot of hard work and a lot of effort that's going on in each one of these states to kind of feed off of what you're saying, Lori. They're not trying. It's just every state has different restrictions, right? And they're working with what they can get. And so it'd be really cool, I agree, Lori, to kind of have a whole episode talking about how even if there's opportunity across the country, it's not equal in every state, and everyone's kind of jumping through and over every kind of hoop that they have to in order to make girls wrestling happen there.
Oh my gosh, 100%. And I would even venture to say that in some of those states that aren't sanctioned, those people and some of the resources and some of the opportunities they're offering are cutting edge, right? They're not maybe hitting that mark yet, but that has nothing to do with them, really. It's sort of, they started this, like to your point, in Pennsylvania, they have 100 schools. They have to kind of like almost sanction one at a time. And it's like, there's these people that said, oh, okay, well, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, so let's go. And they have this wrestler grind mentality, and they're just going at it. So happy to share out some of the things that they're doing and give them a platform to share it too. So
yeah. Shout out to Brooke Zumas, who I know is producing a lot of great content out of PA right now.
Oh my gosh, Brooke Zumas out of PA. Also Pat Tossi, who helps out, who's an amazing person.
Yeah,
Chris Atkinson. And then Charlotte Bailey in Iowa, Kira Berry, our very own Kira Berry in New York, who's been at it for years. So good. Yeah.
So many good people, all working really hard.
All right, 2 more amazing people that we cannot not talk about when we talk about high school development, because these ladies, Jackie, who am I talking about?
Oh my gosh. You can't talk about girls or women's wrestling without talking about Andrea Yamamoto and Joan Fulp. The like heroes of girls high school sanctioning and just girls wrestling in general, to be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They have done so much. They are the leaders of the USA Wrestling High School Development Committee, and every grassroots group basically across the country that's gotten sanctioned has worked with them. So I feel like they were the catalyst for our learning at Division I Women's Wrestling. We were like, a development committee. In fact, we called ourselves that for a while. we're the development committee. So yeah, they're those people that are change agents. And so I can't wait I haven't even really talked to them about this yet, but I know they'll come on because they're awesome. So we'll talk to them. We'll learn from them. It'll be great.
Spoiler alert, guys, you're coming on the show.
Yeah, you're invited. Forgot to tell you, but it's okay. All right, well, we're going to talk more about Joan now, because Joan is not only on the high school development committee, but she wears a lot of hats in wrestling. So she is on the, I'm going to get this wrong. Oh, okay. Give a second. She's on the Junior Wrestling Committee, the Junior Olympic Wrestling Committee for USA Wrestling, because she's the chairperson for the Women's Age Group Council. And, Jackie, she is the second vice president on USA Wrestling's executive committee.
Yeah, she's sort of the boss.
I mean, really. And so, but if anyone else is feeling like that was super confusing, you're not alone, because I'm like, wait, what? I know she's really important. She has all these like amazing roles, but like some of that governance is confusing to me, if I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's important, as we try to come up with ideas for growing women's wrestling and trying to get proposals heard by those committees that are making decisions, that we understand how a bill becomes a law. Like maybe we'll roll out you're probably too young for this, but some Schoolhouse Rock.
No. Right? I got it.
We'll sing some ditties, and we'll like sing some tunes to like remind ourselves of like how this goes, because it's
an animator, someone who can make a cartoon out of it.
That's what we need.
Yeah. No, I know it's super confusing. I mean, all we all really need to know right now is Joan is a lady boss, and she can give us a little bit more insight to what the heck these things mean. Like you said, Lori, how a bill becomes a law, how we get communication through. She's been working on in every role of women's wrestling and girls wrestling since ever. So she is the right person from like day one. She has been working on girls and women's wrestling all across the country, and was one of the driving, her and her husband, my college coach, were 2 really important people for California sanctioning wrestling. So I'm very excited. She's the perfect person to be in those positions.
And I think if we all just have to take a breath, right? And no one, it's a safe space in terms of trying to figure out how we correctly roll this out and correctly learn this. So nobody's like, how does this work and how does that work? And tell us all. It's literally like, let's just unpack this together. Let's have courageous conversations and and try to figure it all out. So good stuff. I can't wait to kind of dive into her brain, and also Mike Clayton. Why we're calling people out, I might as well call everybody out. He does a great job for USA Wrestling, so I'd love to connect with him and sort of have him help us figure it out and how we can educate and make it more transparent. That's all.
Yeah, Mike is another amazing one. Good thought leader. Great thought leader in the sport.
Yeah. So, all right. So we want to get some information about how we get those proposals or those ideas presented at the national convention in August. I did go to the national convention this past August for USA Wrestling, and that's where the Junior Olympic Committee meets and discusses some of the different things that go on throughout the year. And so one of the big things they talked about this year, Jackie, was Fargo.
Yeah.
And so Fargo is an interesting one, right? Like we love Fargo. Who doesn't? Well, there's like a
love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
You know? You love it, you hate it, you love to hate it, you hate to love it. It's somewhere all in there.
That's actually a great way to say it. Yeah. Well, what you just said, exactly how I feel about Fargo. But we do, there are a lot of topics around Fargo. So I'm not sure exactly how this will play out. And it gets a little scary with opinions and, what it should be and what it shouldn't be. But there's a lot to talk about. And so definitely something that we want to possibly touch on and hear some more about.
Yeah. Also, I mean, like over the past 10 years, I've been going to Fargo for close to 10 years. Women's and girls wrestling at Fargo has changed every time. Like weight classes have changed, the schedule, having dual meets, taking dual meets out, age groups, who's allowed to wrestle, who's not allowed to wrestle, state affiliations. So many things have changed. And I think that a lot of really great ideas came from that. So I think if we can open up a conversation in an episode about just kind of shooting the shiz, I'll say, about different options that we could be having there, I would love to hear some new stuff, because I do think that at every time that there has been a change, there's been a loss, but there's also been some major gains. And I think whoever we can have on, or if anyone wants to chime in, there's probably some really great ways to make girls and women's wrestling stronger at the Fargo presence. I agree.
And it's just about starting to kind of unravel that and see what we can do better. And we're doing a lot of great things. I mean, there's so many women there now. And
oh my God.
So one of the things I love about Fargo is that you really get to see these rivalries that have started over the years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So, for a good chunk of time, there was when New York, this is before I moved to New York, I was still in California when New York beat California in the dual meet championship there. So that was awesome. And then there was this big rivalry back and forth. Then it was California and Washington. It's very exciting to see each state start making progress, and then they become like the new person to have a rivalry with. So super exciting.
And it's just when you see it in that arena, and you're like, wow, this doesn't have to just happen in this arena, because
totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. So people get excited about women's athletics. People get excited about women's wrestling. If you don't believe me, go to some of these bigger women's wrestling events and watch the mat side antics. People are into it. 100%.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And we do need to do a better job. So we want to build out on the show some rivalries. Rivalries are fun. And, what's going on at the collegiate level with women's wrestling? Who are the schools that are sort of vying for those positions, going back and forth each year? Who are the wrestlers who have gone back and forth on matches? Even the coaches, right? What's that sort of dynamic like at the women's collegiate level? So kind of starting to unpack that, I think will be fun. So,
yeah. I think men's wrestling does a really great job at that. As a whole, wrestling maybe could do better. Lori, you and I were talking what is it about UFC that makes it more exciting for people to watch than wrestling? They're pretty much the same, combat sports. But I now reflecting upon it, it's storytelling, it's having villains, it's knowing the health of people, oh my God, are they injured, who beat who last time? It's exciting clips of stuff, and men's wrestling I think does a really great job at building these stories and really sharing these stories. So how can we do that for women's wrestling too?
Spot on. That is literally exactly what I tried to say but couldn't, so thank you so much. All right. So that's, listen, we could go on and on and on about topics that we want to cover. Literally, there's like 15 that we scratched out. But this is just whetting everyone's appetite for what's coming, because we want you to tune in. We want this show to be successful. And so we wanted to let you know what's coming. So please, please, please watch for some of these show topics. So at the end of most shows, we're going to try to do this now. So Jackie, this was your idea, and I absolutely love it. And you talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but it's this sort of flip the script kind of thing, right? Like, what can we say are calls to action for our listeners to tune in and to be a part of what is happening good in the world of women's wrestling, what people are advocating, what is out there in the media, so that we make sure that we're tuning in to be a part of it. So the first thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is, first of all, we should be reading articles and tuning in to the division at Midlands that was added this year, because that is humongous, right? Why is that so huge?
A women's collegiate division, or I guess a women's collegiate division alongside a pre-existing men's event. Has that ever happened? I don't know that that's happened. Like maybe small, like women's matches at men's duels, or like parallel men's and women's duels maybe, but like not a major men's wrestling event with a women's division included in it. That would be like, the ultra exciting thing would be to have women's and men's NCAAs happening at parallel, so it's groundbreaking, I think.
It's totally groundbreaking. And Gary Abbott wrote an article for USA Wrestling I was reading, I think it was yesterday, and he basically phrased it like, Midlands, come to this event, this women's event. Oh, and the men will be there too. Like he kind of liked the way he wrote it.
I love that.
And also being, featured at Midlands this year.
So, good job, Gary. Yeah. I love that.
And he is a gender ally for women's wrestling, no doubt.
Totally. Long
time. Yeah, before it was cool to like women's wrestling, right? Yeah. So.
Yes.
And then we also wanted to talk a little bit about our very own at FloWrestling, Kyle Klingman, who now is doing those women's weekly. We love Kyle; he's amazing, and very organically, just loves women's wrestling. Is just a good human, and so he has been putting out a women's weekly. So this comes out cadence-wise. You're hearing it weekly, so we want to make sure that we're reading it and we're sharing it and we're celebrating it, and we're grateful to him for being that change agent for women's wrestling.
Yes. Share. Yeah. Pull stuff out, repost it, share it, tag it, send it to the girls on your team, the guys on your team, the parents on your team, send it to your administrators, send it to local newspapers, get it out there, get all the women's stuff out there.
Agreed. And so the last thing I want to talk about before we sort of end for the day, and I think we did such a good job. Wow, we are under an hour here, which I was nervous about. So, but we did it. But the last thing I want to talk about is a time, Jackie, when you were a change agent, when you were that, as they say at the Tucker Center, which we didn't even talk about the Tucker Center, but a disruptor. We'll talk about that at some point. You're doing things differently, right? Because nothing changes if nothing changes. It's actually the first time that I heard the name Jacque Davis. So you took it upon yourself to create this event when you were the Beat the Streets director in New York for women. And you literally, I don't know how you mustered the courage to put this event on Gotham City open for the first time. So tell us a little bit about that and how you sort of pushed through, maybe you had to have fear and trepidation about that event. Tell us about it a little bit.
So I moved to New York in 2013, and I was at a college just for a little bit. I finished wrestling in college, decided I didn't want to keep wrestling at the senior level. Some chumps like Michaela Hutchinson and Helen Maroulis were in my weight class. So, I wasn't even remotely close to coming up with them. So, made the decision to move to New York and was very lucky to get this position. But when I went there, I guess that backstory is that there were already incredible people. I just got to get looped in to Beat the Streets, right? So I had really, really great mentors, male and female mentors at Beat the Streets. One of them, Ken Bigley, if he's listening, was one of the biggest change agents for me. He really took me under his wing and helped guide me. And he had already decided that he wanted to host a girls freestyle tournament. So in New York City, girls wrestling through their like their inner city sports league, the public, the PSAL, School Athletic League, had women's wrestling, girls wrestling sanctioned. So he wanted to do a girls tournament. He wanted to have it in there. And I was like, I want to do a girls tournament. So I don't actually know if I started it or he started it or we started it together. I was like, I want to call it Gotham City Girls Open. I thought it was kind of like, with the G's were kind of cool. Maybe a little bit too close to Batman, but whatever. So it really, the first year was all New York City girls. I think there were 2 girls from upstate New York that came in. And it was hosted in a local high school, in Wingate High School in Brooklyn. And it was awesome. And then I was coaching, you had talked about in my bios, coaching for some USA Wrestling national tours and international tours. And I got the opportunity, I think that year, to go and coach at Pan Am's in Guadalajara. And I met a young woman there who was wrestling, and she reached out to me. Was like, I want to bring my team to New York so they can train. I'm like, we have a tournament. Do you want to come to the tournament? And it sort of just spiraled from there, where when she came, then I started talking at all these coaches that I'd meet at international trips in Italy or France or wherever, Canada. I would just invite them. And it sort of kept blossoming and booming into just a little bit bigger, like New York City and Mexico, New York City, Mexico, and Italy, New York City, Mexico, Italy, France. And the more that people came, the more that other people wanted to come. And so it was a little bit scary. But actually it was more like exciting than scary, right? Like my biggest goal was I knew we couldn't take our Beat the Streets girls to other countries to cross train. That's just way too expensive. It was never going to happen. And it was also hard to get them out of the city, right? So if we could bring some of the best people from all over the country to come in and train and like compete, like do some training and do some competing, that was like the dream. And then at the same time, myself and Kira Berry were working at trying to drive the growth of women's wrestling at Columbia University. So then let's host the tournament at Columbia so women can see that they can belong in these campuses as well. You can have athletics and academics. So it just kind of kept the next step after the next step, invite more people, show them where they belong, get everybody training and communicating and building this like global family together was sort of the goal. Scary, but exciting.
I was just so blown away when I came to it, because it really was the first time I'd been to a girls' women's wrestling event that was international in the States. I don't think there's many of them, right? Like,
yeah, I think maybe like smaller stuff, right? Like dual meets or smaller tournaments, but nothing that big that I know of. I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, crowd. But nothing that big yet. So.
And it just, I think the way that you rolled it out and you and your team, and it made the athletes that were part of it just want to come back. And it made everyone feel so good that so much care was taken and so much thought was put into it. And so it strikes me because it was you and your team, and you were sparking an idea and then you ran with it. And I think, like you were trying to make it better for women. And that's what we all need to try to be doing. Like, have these ideas, don't be afraid to move forward on them. And one of the biggest things we learn in wrestling, right, is don't be afraid to fail. Like try, say, talk, like fail, and then we'll get back on board and we'll know, oh, well, that doesn't work. We'll try something else. So that's what I love about this change agent idea.
I think also it was a little bit like I said, so Ken Bigley, he was, he's an amazing human being. So he worked with the Public School Athletic League and worked with Beat the Streets. He was 50-50 employee. And so he was just such an ally, when things were maybe like, oh, I don't know if we're allowed to do that through the like Public School Athletic League, or I don't know if we're allowed to do that through Beat the Streets. It'd be finding a way to maneuver those things together in order to make progress happen. He was never like a no-sayer. It was always like, well, what can we do to try and make this progress happen, And I thought, it really, that event couldn't happen without the blanket of Beat the Streets and without the blanket of the Public School Athletic League stepping up
Mhm.
and saying, like, what can we do, instead of finding reasons for why we can't do it. So big shout out to both of those, because literally it made many memories and many friendships and many like educational opportunities. We had colleges coming in and doing a college fair. Girls got the opportunity to be seen there.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I'm just grateful. I'm grateful for all the people who were like, yeah, jumping on board and working with me, or like taking charge on things that maybe I was a little bit too fearful. But also, don't be scared to ask questions. Like, just don't be scared to ask. I asked Cliff Keen, like literally out of nowhere, met Tom Keen at an event, and was like, hey, we do this girls event. Would you maybe want to sponsor it? He's like, absolutely. Like, if I didn't ask, you
Yeah.
wouldn't have said yes. So don't be scared to ask questions. The worst thing that people can say is, nah, not this time. And same thing for every other person that supported it. They all just weren't scared to ask.
That is such valuable advice, especially for women. And I heard you say one other really valuable thing. Don't be afraid, anyone out there, to, if there is someone like Jacque Davis in your wrestling community, if you're lucky enough to have someone like Jacque Davis who's being brave and putting herself out there and trying to do something new, when she hits obstacles, because she's going to, when these female wrestlers hit obstacles as they're trying to create programs and create opportunities, because they're going to, they're going to look behind them and they're going to be like, who's here to like pick me up and show me the way, or support me with this difficult problem and help me come to a solution. Like, let's encourage people to be behind these women, because it's scary to take those steps, and you might not be the person out front, but be the person behind, right? Who's helping, right, and supporting and encouraging. So this has literally been such an awesome conversation, Jacque. I am so grateful to you for you taking the time as a new mom to do this and to be the very first guest. There is not a better person to have sat and had this conversation with. So I really just value you so much.
Oh my God. Are you kidding? I'm so grateful to be here. I mean, gratitude's the name of the game. I'm so grateful to be here. And Lori, you're awesome. And thank you for letting me share my family, my son on here. Today is actually his 4-week birthday. So
he's a month today?
He's a month on Sunday, but 4 weeks. So 19th he was born, but he was born 4 Fridays ago. So I don't know, whatever, confusing. But 4 weeks ago, that little sucker was in the hospital with me. So thank you for letting me share my family. I think like for me, I can think of like probably, I don't know, Marcy Van Dusen, who is my college coach. She had children and like is a leader in Titan Mercury Wrestling. Erin Vandiver, right? Like, she is like leading SEM wrestling and having her children and her family. There aren't a lot of women in women's wrestling in leadership or compete. Catherine Shy, one of my best friends, she's somebody as well, but there's not a ton to like look to. So I think, thank you for letting me bring my family into this, as I think it's important to know, like, you can do it. you can be in the wrestling community and you can have your family, and maybe it's not going to look the same, right? Like, if you're still competing, maybe that looks different because that's just biology. But there's always ways to be involved, and so I'm grateful that you let me share my family and me in this space together.
Well, that is what everything women's wrestling is going to be all about. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jacque, and we will see everybody next time.
Bye.